Hey Gita, how's life?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
Good. I think getting ready for the holidays and trying to wrap up everything that needs to happen.
Exactly, me too.
Yeah. Yeah, lots of news that has happened in Indonesia over the past month. I don't, it wasn't a slow one, that's for sure. I guess, I think Prabowo has come into his own,
Yeah.
starting to make moves, economy's starting to shift. Of
Yep.
course, the US election as well. So
Yep.
everything seems to be interacting with each other. I think the fun one that's up front is Apple had this huge debate with the Indonesian government around
Yeah.
the ban slash prohibition on the sale of iPhone 16 devices. Gita, what's
Yeah.
your perspective or
Oh,
summary of the
no.
situation? Yeah.
Okay, so we have this regulation that requires a certain amount of a product should have in quote unquote Indonesian content. So things that are made in Indonesia or parts that are made in Indonesia. And because the iPhone 16 doesn't fulfill that, then it cannot be sold in Indonesia. And by the way, this is why it's really important to also talk about not just the greater economic implication for a country, which is how come Apple doesn't invest into your country? But also to think about when policymakers make decisions about these things, are they thinking about consumers? Because from the Indonesian side, a lot of people were very angry and very up in arms because they're thinking, why are you taking my right to buy things I like? In a nutshell, right? And mind you, the iPhone 16 is probably only affordable for like 0.5% of people or something like that. But in general, it's this question of, wait, how come you're taking my right to buy something? So the government had to also step on the gas and try to get this investment deal. And at first, it was $100 million. The thing is, Apple was already investing billions into our neighboring countries. And that became problematic for the Indonesian side, but they needed a quick solution because, again, the question isn't just an iPhone. The question is, okay, what about other types of goods that more people can buy that they won't be able to buy because of this regulation? And in the end, Apple decided to invest $1 billion, which the Indonesian government accepted as they should. And now we're going to have iPhone 16. But I think, again, this brings into question a great book I read is called The Friction Project. And this question of, do decision makers experience the same friction as the people that they serve? So if your constituents experience a certain type of friction and you don't, will that make you able to make decisions that actually save them from that friction, right? Or are you just in your nice, pretty kingdom saying all these rules, but you're never really experiencing any of the problems? And yeah, this iPhone 16 situation is one of very many things where a typical Indonesian person is asking, okay, government, are you experiencing what I'm experiencing? Because you're making decisions that may not serve me. That's in a nutshell. Because, by the way, lots of people said, no, it's good. Indonesia should hold out until it's $1 billion. But actually, a lot of Indonesians still went, no, actually, 100 million is fine. It's better than nothing. So there's good and bad, pros and cons for each of this.
It's interesting because in the technology circles that we have, from the outside looking in, it was very much, wow, Apple folded because his opening offer was like $10 million.
Yes.
It goes up to $100 million offer.
That's true. I
Now
almost
it's
forgot about that.
$1 billion. I'm like, that's really good haggling. Like it was probably like some American guy sitting next to some like Southeast Asian counterparty and they haggled the price up. Like not just 10x, but like 100x. I think that's a really good deal, right?
No, fair. Yes. No, by the way, fair. And I always believe Indonesians should try to get the highest amount offered. Yes. But again, brings into question for a typical Indonesian person, do they mind the wait? And oftentimes they do, right? Because they're the ones thinking, okay, while you're still figuring things out, what about me? And this is just an iPhone 16. Again, a luxury product that is simply not affordable for most people. But the question is, what about other products that are in the similar vein of, do you have enough Indonesian made content in you?
Yeah, for us, it was like, I feel like, wouldn't every country try to do this now? Because wouldn't Apple become a pinata for everybody because we are like $1 billion, for a 300 million, but relatively low GDP per capita country that's a domestic content. So you'd be like, yeah, okay, Vietnam is about third smaller, right? Could it get, I don't know, they already have $15 billion of investments from Apple anyway. Could it get more? I'm just saying they play hardball versus other countries they can imagine. I don't think Brunei is going to jump in on this game, I would say.
They're also
I think they're
doing very well.
They're doing very well. They can afford all the iPhone 16s they want already, right? But I'm just saying there's a lot of countries that will be like, oh, this makes total sense. And I think it goes back to this piece we talked about, which is like the world's kind of like deglobalizing, like the whole idea of, you do the manufacturing wherever it's cheapest and we buy it at the cheapest possible price. Now everybody's okay. And then I'm just joking in my head, but imagine like all the content in your phone is, I don't know, you need X percentage from Indonesia, you need X, Y percentage from Singapore, you need Z percentage from Thailand. Then I'm pretty sure the total percentage of components are probably like 200%. Yeah, exactly. 100%. It's just be like,
Again, I think it also is probably a good indicator of how Indonesian ministers and policymakers right now are viewing where things are, right? I think it's very obvious that Mr. Prabowo, the president, is doing his best to reach out to the international community. He's considered the best ambassador we've had because he is. He's just really bringing up Indonesian issues to the global stage. And what I think it does internally, domestically, is that it makes a lot of the domestic policymakers really consider how are their decisions making larger implications outside. Because one of the biggest problems for Indonesia for the longest time is we've been very insular. We've been very inward looking. So we're constantly thinking that this is just generalization in a nutshell, because there are definitely very many people who think outside of this box. But this concept of as long as we're okay and we can fulfill our own demand and we're good, then everything's fine. So it's not a long-term outlook of how are we geopolitically if we continue on this trajectory of economic growth and social policies. Like, how does that set us up for success, let's say 30 years from now on the world stage? That tends to not be the conversation. Like, our politics are very well known for being quite short term and just very well known for constantly looking in. And so I think because our president is currently looking out, a lot of the ministers and policymakers are starting to look out. And that's, I think, is probably what caused a lot of these negotiations to turn out well for Indonesia.
Yeah, speaking about Prabowo as ambassador, I think I watched on Instagram the clip of Prabowo calling Donald Trump. And I thought it was quite interesting. I don't know. I don't normally call Gita and I'll be like, hey, I'm just recording you right now.
Yeah.
I'm putting you so I thought it was quite interesting. Is that like normal or I have no idea?
I don't know. Maybe yes. I have no idea, actually. I think it's normal for presidents to call each other. To what extent, I'm not sure. But that is one of the things that he's trying to improve geopolitical relationship across the board and maintain Indonesia's position as a neutral power, but not just neutral, but as a middle ground of some sort. So basically showing that, no, we are not necessarily pro-China, pro-US, because it's also not about that. It's more about Indonesia is pro-Indonesia, just like any other country is pro their country, right? And to just ensure that people don't see the country as being a tool for another country. I think that's the big focus right now. And so I think it's so important to put Indonesia on the global stage, but also just know how to position ourselves so that we end up pursuing our own interests rather than everyone else's.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting because there was like a couple of lines that happened. I think Prabowo said, wherever you are, I'm willing to fly to congratulate you personally.
I think
it's based on scheduling. He made that commitment to be like in there. I did enjoy the part where Trump said that Prabowo's English was good.
Prabowo's English is probably better than a lot of people's. He also speaks multiple languages, by the way. He's not some random person. He's very educated.
He is very well educated. It's funny that it's like American colleagues. Wow,
Like,
you're
you speak
Singaporean and your
English.
English is pretty good. What language do you speak in Singapore?
And oh my gosh, the amount of times I've heard people ask, my gosh, so what do they speak in Singapore? And I would have to go, English? And they're like, even though they're Chinese, they're like, no, don't say that. They're Singaporean.
Yeah.
It's a nation. It's a sovereign nation.
I did have that situation where I was applying to an Ivy League institution and I was trying to get and I did say on a call, I was like, yeah. She was like, oh, where are you from? So I can pull up your file. And I was like, Singapore. And then she was like, oh, like which part of China? And I was like, oh, all these tropes. It's true.
It's true.
It's true that people say this stuff. Look, I don't blame her. Like geography is not the easy part. If you ask me like, hey, what is X country? I'll probably like, I don't know. But it was just this. It happens. It's okay. It'll change over time. I'm sure maybe 10 years down the road, she like goes on Instagram. She sees, I don't know, the Changi airport in Singapore. She, oh no, I remember I was this person who made this claim.
One time someone actually asked me in the US, which part of India is Indonesia in?
Ooh.
Yeah, it blew her mind that the country is 200-ish million people at the time. And it also blew her mind that India is more than 1 billion, because she's really realizing how big these places are. And it was a really nice primer on geography.
Yeah, that is that definitely does take the cake there.
Which brings us to travel.
Okay, so what we wanted to talk about travel was that recently I think there's some news about how I think Traveloka is facing a lot of increased competition from lots of different providers. Obviously, the regional competitors, there's one. Those are the Chinese travel providers are also starting to come in. We've never really actually talked about the travel and the booking space. So Gita, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Personally, I actually like the travel booking space because I believe that out of so many, I've been in the startup world here in Indonesia for 14 years. Out of so many of these types of digitalization and digital products, travel is actually one of the few that's truly digital, like as in no real need for physical exhibitions and offline stores or anything like that. Those are used mainly from a marketing perspective, but it's really digital. If you think about Traveloka, there's really not much difference between that and a lot of digital booking platform. That is what I mean when I say it's truly digital, because when I look at, I don't know, hundreds of decks every year, right? Even the ones that say they're digitalizing X sector or democratizing X sector, there's always some kind of offline component to it that makes scaling it, especially for countries like Indonesia, where things like 5G is not even like universal coverage. Like these types of places. So we're not talking about United States context. We're not talking about UK, which is very different digital infrastructure, but we're talking Indonesia and other similar emerging nations. It is very hard usually to have a pure digital play. And travel booking just happens to be one of them, which means that if they scale, they can truly scale. Now, the question becomes the market itself. So if you're in the travel space, you're going for usually the middle class. And as we all know, the middle class in Indonesia has shrunk by a lot. And it's not just about the middle class itself. It's not just about how much money they make, but it's about how secure are they. And how secure they are is a combination of many things. For example, do they have enough savings? Do they feel secure food-wise and basic needs-wise? Do they have enough social support system that just in case anything happens, they won't be taken towards bankruptcy? Basically, are they in a class where even a diagnosis of an illness can bring them back down socioeconomic classes? So that's really the question, like how secure are they in their position? And travel is just simply one of those areas that target that market that is actually still quite vulnerable in emerging markets. So if you look at a middle class in Indonesia, it's probably not very different from a middle class in other emerging markets, which is you're not very safe and secure in where you are. It's very different than if you're a middle class in Europe. Basically, you're probably one serious illness away from something very bad happening to your economic. And I think that is what makes that travel space challenging to navigate in emerging markets. But do I think as a business model, it's quite solid? Actually, yes. It's also very scalable. You can even scale it outside of Indonesia, of course, because again, it's just a digital booking platform. But again, the question is your market tough enough to withstand all these different macroeconomic shocks that can happen in an emerging market?
Yeah. I think it's really fascinating because I think Traveloka is one of those companies that I feel are really solid. I think they've done a great job. They stayed after news. I think this is focusing on what they're supposed to do. I think it was founded back in 2012 between Albert, Ferry, and Derianto. I think the bull scenario is really like they said, the Indonesian middle class continues growing. They travel more. And they use the Traveloka platform because it's the market leader from a Indonesia perspective. I think the bear scenario is like you said, is from a travel perspective, there are huge economies of scale. It's quite easy to localize your content, your listings. So for a Chinese provider that's doing a sea trip, for example, their home base is China. So the Chinese consumer traveling to Indonesia as a destination. But then you can imagine them making inroads to eventually go after the Indonesian middle class as the traveler, which is a different segment. So I think it's an interesting piece because it feels like at the end of the day, if you ask me in my head, like maybe in 50 years, they all acquire each other and become like a giant super app. Because it's just point to point. What's the long lasting advantage there? It's not going to be language localization.
No. Maybe there could be a super app, but again, the market itself, the baseline itself, that has to be in an economically secure position. And again, that is the problem. So when you're looking at emerging markets like Indonesia, there's a tendency to go, hey, there's poverty, which still exists, of course, and it's quite high. There's poverty, and then there's the 1%. But people really forget about these ginormous middle ground. And I recently attended a guest lecture by Pak Khatib Basri, who was our ex-minister of finance, and he's now on the economic advisory board. And he was talking about the Chilean paradox issue, which was in 2019, despite Chile having such positive economic indicators like high human development index, growing GDP per capita, how come when they raised certain prices, there was such large social unrest that there could have been a revolution? And again, the question is, how secure was that middle class? And that is something that will plague Indonesia as we grow, because you need to ensure that with higher GDP per capita, it's not just higher GDP per capita where Jakarta takes up 4x of that growth. And then there are many parts of Indonesia that's still dealing with stunting. You have to ensure that for the most part, a very large majority, people are experiencing similar social and economic benefits from the growth, right? And that is, I think, really what we should watch out for. Because if not, it's not just a question of travel. It's basically everything else that has to do with middle class consumption. Then it's a question of, okay, how's retail? How's garment? How's anything else, right? And so I think the travel space, of course, hopefully can continue to grow, and maybe they will start consolidating, but that market piece, that has to be taken care of.
Yeah, I think there are two aspects I want to discuss, which is the travel piece and then I think the middle class component. I think on the travel piece, one of the hottest competitors in my head is really Agoda, which is, I think for me, is like a regional Southeast Asian travel player. But the interesting part is that Agoda is actually part of Booking Holdings, which is a global conglomerate. Because they also run Kayak, Booking.com, which is really interesting actually if you think about it, because all this is doing is just creating regional brands that are known by the local consumer, but the back end is the same, right? Which is like an inventory of flights, hotels, and travel experiences. And it's a booking platform that does all of it. So it's huge economies of scale. So to me, I think that's the interesting part. Travel has that momentum to start acquiring more and rolling them up and bundling them. A little bit actually similarly for recruitment job portals out there, right? There's a lot of individual job portals that you think exist, but actually they're all like Glassdoor and Indeed. They're all part of the same conglomerate, right?
Yeah.
Which is just running these different supposedly shop fronts.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting piece. I don't necessarily know if it's about Traveloka, but you can imagine more and more regional travel portals getting acquired, for example, by these Chinese or by global conglomerates to create that local face for the local middle class as a booking place and booking behavior. But the actual engine, the actual transportation, the actual logistics and booking is actually being done by a global shared service. And I think that's less about Traveloka and more about, I think, the fact that every country, and I think this applies to Klook in Singapore. This is the dynamics of the industry competition dynamics. I think it will be interesting how that pans out. I think the middle class is actually quite interesting as well because everybody loves the middle class, right? The politicians talk about supporting the middle class in every election. Obviously, the middle class are voting. They say they do. Whether they do or not in terms of policy is another thing altogether.
Correct.
And I think what's definitely true is that I think the technology sector is actually very tied to the middle class, right? Because if your economy is primarily dominated by low income, obviously you're buying tech or iPhones or going on data. And obviously, if your country is primarily run by the elite or upper class, then they themselves don't really need or buy that much technology. I think technology is very tied to the middle class as a social norms, social behaviors, economic purchases. So it's been interesting to see quite a lot of bets. One of the things that I do as an angel is that I'm investing, and a lot of it, if you asked me 3 to 4 years ago, was very much, there was a bet was like on a rising Indonesian middle class, right? So the bet was like, hey, people are going to eat more chicken, right?
More protein.
So there's broiler eggs. People are going to use more cold chain, so fresh factory. People are going to buy more packaging, so they're going to do more recycling, like ecosystem. So these are investments that you're thinking about. And of course, like you said, is if that conveyor belt is falling apart, then some of that assumptions is different. But hopefully it continues,
You know what? I think also this is just the growing pains of an emerging country. I don't think my friend wants to be quoted because he's quite a private guy, but another fellow investor friend of mine once gave a really good analogy on investments and what happened with the boom in tech that came It started 2014, 15 or 2012 or something like that. His big thing is at the time, because there was just so much hype, so much excitement, and also tech was seen as a way for so many people to break out of their socioeconomic classes, because there were all these very inspirational stories about founders who started, quote unquote, from zero. By the way, there's no such thing. No one starts from zero. They start from zero to hero. And it just is seen as this promised land. And also with the amount of funding coming in, all these tech players were just paying way above market. And so people really started seeing it as, wow, I'm a 25-year-old making 4 or 5x what my parents did working back then. So this is my way to the top. So I think so much of the disappointment is because people just had very high expectations. And what my friend said in the investment world that we did was we created essentially, quote unquote, middle school. So basically, we invest into all stages, all sectors, multiple check sizes, multiple check types. But it was just based out of so much hype and so much interest that we didn't think about how to structure it so that all these companies have their fundamentals right. So they have kindergarten to grade school, and then they do middle school, and then they do high school, and then they do university. But no, they just get all these checks, and then we go, now you IPO. Now you get acquired by a very large conglomerate. The problem is we just didn't think about, okay, how do you build new businesses in these countries? How do you build sustainable, lasting businesses that fundamentally make sense? When people ask me like, oh, what sector are you bullish? Or I'm like, look, there's opportunity in a lot of sectors. But again, the question is your economics right? You eventually make more money than you spend. Even that's an equation that so many people just forgot, right? Because it was just so much money movement, so much flow, so much hype, so much FOMO. And we really just don't think about the building blocks of what makes a place a great place to start businesses and grow them and make them last sustainably.
Yeah, I agree. And I am favorable of people looking and joining the technology sector, right? Because technology is about the future and building the future and using technology to transform the lives of millions of people. And I think Indonesia, if I'm not wrong, 2023, I think grew GDP was by about 5%. And then the digital economy grew about 16%, right? Yeah. If you join the tech world, if it's growing 16% versus growing 5%, obviously you're going to have a better career, better life. You can be a business owner. And that means that also you're not just growing and building the country, but you're also substituting the physical economy into the digital economy, right? Because the difference between 5 versus 60%, 11% came from somewhere and it came from the rest of the economy, right? So I think there's a substitution effect that goes on. So I think there's nothing wrong with being saying, I want to be a business owner and I'm going to compete with the incumbents by being more efficient, less friction. I think it makes sense. It's just that I think, exactly like you said, there's so many gaps. And I think people are starting to realize what those gaps are. Like for me, I've always had a big issue with like accounting, which was like the number of people who just could not account properly. And I think there's a difference between like willful fraud versus negligence. And obviously, and I think the interesting part is, look, there's always going to be fraud in every market because people think they can get away with it. But I think the number of founders, of Indonesian founders I've met who just got screwed because they didn't understand their own accounting is shocking. It's a very high percentage. I would say that 1 in 3 Indonesian founders that I've met struggle with their own accounting. And what the struggle is, what is been told to them by their accountant or whatever it is, so that's the norm, versus what investors say they want to hear. And then the weird debate about how it should be presented in the best possible light, but ends up being divorced from the management reality of how it actually works. I think 1 in 3 Indonesian founders have that dilemma. And I think most Indonesian founders will eventually just end up defaulting to this is what works for me. I'll say 1 in 3 Indonesian founders are always like having this huge, I don't know what's the word, debate or purgatory or limbo, where they're just literally asking me a question like, is this GMV or is this revenue or is this contribution margin? Because I think if it's contribution margin, it looks better. And I'm like, but no.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Do I have this conversation every week? Oh my gosh.
So it's higher than 1 in 3 for you, maybe.
I don't know. I do have this conversation very frequently. I think it's also not great that there's such a culture of shame in the startup ecosystem in Indonesia, where people in general, I don't think just in the startup world, a lot in Indonesian culture, where there's this shame culture of you don't want to look bad. You don't want to look like you don't know. You don't want to look like you fail. So what tends to happen that I've seen in my own experience is the amount of people who just get into so much trouble simply because they're too scared to check. They're too scared to being seen as dumb, incompetent, don't know. How could you not know? And honestly, a lot of investors and a lot of people also don't do a great job of supporting them in a way where we've seen this a lot, or you don't need to bring down someone who's already down, I guess. They're already there. But I think just this shame culture makes people just avoid conflict, avoid trying to find things out. And the problem with startups, especially if it's your startup, is in the end, you're answering to that. Like the failure of your startup, and I always say this too, like the growth of your startup is probably going to be limited by your own personal growth. So if you're unable to face yourself, or you're unwilling to accept that you are limited in these ABCD places, it's going to be very hard for your company to grow, pivot, thrive, whatever. Insert positive terminology, right? Yeah, I think that is also one of the things that I've seen inhibit a lot of not just founders, but teams, including investors too. Just lots of fear, lots of shame.
Yeah. And I think fear and shame, natural human emotions.
Yeah.
In the context of a very fragile startup where you might have 8 months to 1 year. If shame is preventing you from doing the accounting and the financial projection to tell people what's going on, and for you to correct aggressively because you are the CEO, the co-founders. That's really what you want to do. What you don't want to do is feel the fear and the shame, which will happen in either scenario. But now you choose not to take action, and then the numbers keep going down, and then you end up telling the board that you've closed or close to closing without any chance of there being a option B or option C.
Oh my gosh. I feel like you've mentioned pretty much every investor's like I'm like, oh, how we've experienced that. And I really always say like fear and shame are just super normal. Everyone feels that. Everyone's insecure. Everyone's not confident 24/7. Of course not, because you're not AI. Everyone feels all these quote unquote challenging feelings. But the question is more, what action can you take? Because if it's stopping you from growing, then what are you doing here? Then honestly, then probably your companies can't survive.
Yeah, not easy. I think on that note, my last question for you would be, if you're a founder feeling a kind of fear or shame, any advice that you would give them?
One, I'm not sure why, but pretty much every founder I've talked to who've admitted feeling shame or feeling afraid or insecure always believe that they're the only one. And you're just not. In fact, I can safely say that in my experience of being in the startup industry for 14 years as both a founder and then a GP and now an LP, it has happened to 100% of people. So one, you're not alone, but two, the question is more, are you going to be limited by your fear, or are you going to unlimit yourself now by simply taking action even if you're afraid? The idea is just to do it scared. Do the thing scared. You're scared of really understanding your numbers and maybe finding out that, yeah, you got scammed or something. I don't know. Just find out, because what's more terrible than a bad mistake today is if the mistake gets maintained for another 1 year or longer. Yeah. That's much worse. So face the bad mistake now so that you don't extend that mistake for the livelihood of your startup. And just do it scared, because everyone's doing it scared. No one's really out there, quote unquote, getting it together and then succeeding. No, they're just scrambling about, trying to do their best. And so that's what I would say. One is you're not alone. And two, don't let your fear limit yourself and just do the thing scared.
Yeah. And my advice would be that if you don't get scared, sometimes as a founder, you're probably a psychopath.
Yeah. Then we have other problems.
Or it's a zero interest rate era where everything was going great. Okay. And so that could be, you're like early stage, you just got a shitload of money. And so you don't feel fear or scared yet.
Sure. Yeah. You have $1 billion valuation at ideation stage. Sure.
Yeah, exactly. Then you're like, oh, you don't feel fear or scared for, I don't know, 2 to 3 years until the money runs out.
Good point.
Then, so that two scenarios, psychopath, or you just had it too easy. But I think the key thing here is...
I love our conversations.
So, I mean... So it's like the default scenario, right? Is that if everybody's feeling scared, it's being a founder is like being an Olympic athlete. It's just hard. It's supposed to be hard. That's why people really respect, and I think you mentioned earlier, like people look at founders as heroes who are successful because they did have to overcome a lot of challenges and adversity to do it. It's just that nobody can be like, wow, I want to be a Mount Everest summiteer without risking death or feeling the pain of doing it or having
and I don't want to train.
Yeah, I don't want to train. Like, duh. Everyone's going to be like, duh. Of course, it'll be very painful. And of course, a lot of people die climbing the Mount Everest, right? And so that's an interesting piece. So when it comes to founder, I think sometimes it's really heroic and it's easy. Sometimes because the industry is like saying, anybody can be a founder. And I'm like, yeah, anyone can be a founder. Yeah. That's the beauty of it. But it is very difficult. And I think you kind of miss that. I feel like the industry doesn't say the second middle piece, which is, you know what? It's okay to tap out. Everybody has to be a founder.
No, no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, anybody can be a founder, if you achieve it, you'll be a hero, and you'll be a hero because it was really hard in between.
Yeah.
And everybody's shitting on you. Everybody's making fun of you on Instagram.
Totally.
And nobody's going to be happy with what you're doing during the chunk of time. But at the end, you get rewarded. So acknowledge this messy middle, right?
Yeah. And the messy middle can be very long. So people think the messy middle is a year. Dude, there are founders who are still grinding it 12, 13, 14 years on, etc. Right? Okay, if you can be the next NVIDIA, cool. Not everyone, right? Most people don't. Yeah. So I always tell all founders, constantly question how you're using your time, because your most expensive asset is not the business or your idea, it's actually your time. Because most likely, if you're a founder, there's a good chance you can also work somewhere else and make quite a bit and just get wealthy the very boring way of saving and investing. There is that, right? Yeah. And that's fine. So the question is more, is that amount of time worth it for you? And just be brutally honest with yourself, because there are also companies I know that are doing quite well. They're not necessarily growing very quickly, but they're also not declining, but they're also not seeing an exit in sight. I know lots of that. And the question for that will be, do you enjoy your time still building this product? If you do, do you? But there are also a lot who just don't anymore. And they're just grinding like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years. And again, the question is like, is this for you the best use of your time? And just understand that even if you tap out, that news will only be very big, mainly for you, because of our ego, of our shame, of our sadness. But the world will most likely not just forgive you, but they'll forget. They do, right?
Yeah, there's something else on Twitter or X.
There's going to be some other news.
Crisis.
Yeah, there's going to be another news. You're not the only one.
Yeah.
So I think it's just asking yourself very hard questions about, is this worth your time? Because your time is the most expensive.
Yeah. Once you just get to decide whether you have the choice to be in or out, and if you choose to be in, then it's very freeing, because now you chose to be in, rather than feeling that you're stuck. And I think so much of life is just like, are you intentional versus feeling trapped? And once you're intentional that you're in it because you want to be in it and because it is hard, then I think it's less painful, right?
Yeah.
So on that note, let's peace out and see you next month.
Okay, I'll see you next month. Take care.